And you can begin now.
Okay, welcome everyone to this afternoon's Dream Research Rounds. And just as I said afternoon, I recognized my place, which is maybe not where you are. So it's afternoon where I am. Good morning, good evening. Good afternoon to you all. My name is Dr. Neera Jain. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of British Columbia Faculty of Medicine. And I'm really pleased to be hosting the research rounds today. And it's really a pleasure to moderate this talk. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today. So Dr. Lise Mogensen is an award-winning medical educator and researcher at the School of Medicine, Western Sydney University in Australia, where she was just promoted to associate professor. So congratulations to you, Dr. Mogensen. She has a background in occupational therapy and holds a PhD in social justice, focusing on disability studies. Dr. Mogensen is a qualitative and mixed methods researcher with an international reach and a preference for co-design, inclusive, and participatory research methodologies. Her research is transdisciplinary, spanning critical disability studies, childhood sociology, health sociology, and medical education. And her key interests focus on disability justice and building equal participation and inclusion for and with children and adults with disability across the lifespan. So Dr. Mogensen's research exploring disability in medical education and practice was pioneering in Australia. And I will say she's one of the researchers who caught my eye early in my journey as a researcher in this field. And her work has demonstrated binational impact on medical education policy. She was a key contributor to the design and development of the new inclusive medical education guidelines launched by the Medical Deans Australia and New Zealand in 2021, which was really a groundbreaking shift in Australia and New Zealand in terms of policy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lise Mogensen. Over to you, Dr. Mogensen.
Thank you so much for your lovely introduction, Neera, and thank you, colleagues, for inviting me to speak today. I am going to share my slides, and hopefully it's the right one. Right, so in this presentation, I'll be working from a brief to talk about the background for my research on disability in medical education and practice. For description, my pronouns are she and her. I am a white female of Scandinavian origin, and today I am wearing a black dress with a golden white floral pattern, I guess. A little bit about me first, and it's probably a bit arrogant to start that way, but there's a purpose with it. My husband and I moved from Denmark to Australia in 1989, and my entry to academia was quite at a mature age. I started studying my undergraduate degree in occupational therapy in 2002 with two little boys at 4 and 6 years of age. And this was after teaching in private enterprise and running my own business for about 10 years or so. My interest in disability studies and inclusive practices stems from my experiences pre-academia of working with children and young people with disability. But it was more my personal experiences as a parent advocate to my youngest son, who has autism and an intellectual disability, he's now 25, that spurred me to take some matters into my own hands when he and I faced barriers, and this eventually led to engagement with disability studies, both professional, more professionally all those years ago. After completing my occupational therapy degrees with honours, I won a government scholarship to do my PhD in social justice, which focused on disability studies and childhood sociology. So this was a total surprise to me. I was first in family to go to university, so I kind of only just expected to scrape through. So yeah, surprising path at the time. My project focused methodologically on including teenagers with autism in research about their lives, and the topic was on experiences of being diagnosed and growing up with a label. This research was published in 2015 and remains quite topical still. My other disability studies research explores challenges across the lifespan, which are often associated with life transitions. But today I will talk about the immediate background for my research in the field that explores disability inclusive medical education and some of the context for this research within my work setting. In particular, I'll talk about, actually that's a little bit later. The public aspect of this research is currently published in 2 articles, one with Duncan Shrewsbury, who's here today, and also contained in a number of conference presentations. I will very briefly outline the findings from this research and highlight some of the persistent challenges to inclusive medical education that I see and experience. This work here was catalyst for recent changes in medical education policy in Australia, as Neera just mentioned, and the creation of new guidelines towards more inclusive approach in medicine. Which is, of course, an important step towards increasing disability and diversity in medicine. Within the presentation, I will explore some of the challenges to inclusive medical education and practice by focusing on the idea of disclosure and using ableism as a lens. I'm going to be referring to Fiona Kumari Campbell's work. I will finish with some thoughts and reflection for discussion on how a disability justice approach may be useful in moving forward in building participation and more visible inclusion of people with disability in the medical profession. To start, however, there are 2 things that I would like to do. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the country we now call Australia. Being mindful that the notion of land includes the waterways, the plants, the animals that live here. The country area on which I live and do most of my work is called Dharawal, or the Dharawal lands. I acknowledge that these lands are unceded lands. Always were and always will be. I do pay my respects to elders past, present, and those who are emerging. I thank them for their support of the work that we get to do in their lands and beyond. And I would also like to extend my respect to all Aboriginal people in other lands and any who are here with us today. For context, Dharawal country is just south of Sydney on the east coast of the continent, as I've shown on this map here. The traditional Dharawal country is just, encompasses about 450 square miles or 1,200 square kilometres from the south of Sydney Harbour. So it's quite small compared to the many other lands. Dharawal National Park is a protected area of 6,500 hectares, which protects several ancient Aboriginal sites and endangered animals and bird species, including a small but healthy colony of koalas. And so, interesting fact, the lyrebird is the traditional Dharawal totem, and it's an expert in sound and voice imitation. The second thing, and for context, I would like to talk a little about the Western Sydney University Medical School, where I've had tenure now for since 2014. I work on the main campus, which is based in Campbelltown, southwest of Sydney, so also on Dharawal country. But we have a number of clinical schools across southwestern Sydney, and 2 rural clinical schools that are respectively about 3 hours and 10 hours drive from Sydney. So our campuses sit on several different lands, but all within the same state of New South Wales. The School of Medicine is a small, young medical school, graduating the first cohort of about 100 MBBS students in 2011. We have been transitioning to the MD degree since 2019, and this year, the last full cohort of MBBS students have just graduated. This year also marked the largest group of new Aboriginal doctors. I think it was about 15 in this cohort. They've graduated from our school, and that's really fantastic. At the school, we have a very strong emphasis on encouraging local residents to apply for medicine and have pathways to support Aboriginal students to study medicine and become doctors, also with support from local elders. And on this slide, there is one of our local elders who's supported the program since the start, Uncle Ivan, and with one of the students. In 2018, we partnered with Charles Sturt University to form a joint program on medicine with a new rural campus that focuses strictly on recruiting rurally based students to educate doctors for the bush. There is a real shortage of rural doctors in Australia, so this partnership is government funded to increase numbers. Charles Sturt University is based in the rural city of Orange, which is about 4 hours drive from Sydney and sits on Wiradjuri country. So a medical program really covers several different lands. The Western Sydney School itself was established for the purpose of addressing medical practitioner shortage in the southwestern parts of Sydney and also rural New South Wales, which were considered to be home to several underserved and marginalised populations. As a university and as a school, we also have a strong focus of being multiculturally inclusive and supporting our LGBTQA+ students and colleagues, and there are various initiatives for these purposes on our websites. Despite all of these initiatives, neither the university nor the medical school have openly been welcoming people with disability to study. This is pretty common for most medical schools in Australia. There are, of course, university-based services in place for students with disability. However, when I took a role as the academic disability coordinator for our school in 2014, I often experienced reluctance from staff to allow prescribed adjustments for students. Initially, I sought some support from empathetic colleagues, but I didn't get anywhere. And when I went to the literature to look at best practice and find out how to best approach these attitudes and support our students, I found no literature at all that was Australian-based. So here was a real gap, both in practice and in knowledge. I started looking at what was going on in other countries, and especially found literature from the US and UK, and reading over some possibly some people that are here today. I can't see people's names, possibly of what you have written. And then successfully I applied for a university grant to start researching. It was very difficult to find stats on the numbers of students with disability enrolled in medical school. It's still in Australia, and it still is. The figures I'm showing here are those provided to me by our University Disability Services when I first started looking into the numbers. Of course, they include those who are registered with the University Services and seek support. So these official figures are likely not that accurate. Disability Services have not released figures for this year, but I had a look at our list of students in our school, and the numbers are very similar, or maybe even slightly lower. The numbers are also for the entirety of students enrolled in courses at the medical school. So include those in any of the postgraduate courses and higher degree research courses, including PhD and master's students. So considering that the prevalence of disability in general Australian population is now approximately 20%, and I believe that this is similar, maybe even a little higher globally, the number of medical students with disability in Australian medical courses remain low. We think less than 2%. And this is low even compared to other post-secondary courses, which seem to sit around 5%. And I believe they might even be lower than the US and the UK numbers, although I don't have the very latest one, but I believe they sit between 4 and 4.5% perhaps. Maybe someone can clarify that for me later. I found then what is now well known, that medical students are often reluctant to disclose disability or illness. And certainly in Australia, there is no requirement to disclose, except when the person seeks accommodations, which we refer to as reasonable adjustments. Miller attributed non-disclosure to fear of discrimination and presumed incompetence, concerns about lack of understanding amongst patients, colleagues, and the general community of what constitutes a disability. This reluctance to disclose seems to persist. In a more recent study, Neera Jain has told us that for some medical students, understandings of stigma were associated with potential risks to their careers and not being seen as capable professionals. And that being public about their disability is seen as a risk from the possibility of losing faculty or peer support for future jobs or training opportunities, and that students sometimes consider carefully political disclosure of access needs or making do with imperfect accommodations in order to appear less difficult. Jan suggests that one reason could be that people with disability often continue to experience social devaluation on account of disability, despite several decades of increased awareness. As mentioned earlier, I had also come across some attitudes within our school with our staff. So I wonder what is at play in medicine, the health and education system, and our society more broadly to create this reluctance and fear. This article led by Duncan Shrewsbury goes some way to explain this reluctance, I think. Duncan contacted me, I think it was 2016, you can correct me later, Duncan, to talk about our common interest. With Professor Wendy Hu, who is the Professor in Medical Education at Western, we started discussing UK and Australian medical education standard and policies, which resulted in this analysis using Barchi's approach to policy analysis. What is the problem represented to be? In contrast to traditional policy analysis, WPR challenges the assumption that problems can be easily defined and are objective in nature. The focus is on problematizations rather than on problems, and on identifying the connections between what policies achieve or do not achieve and the assumptions upon which they're founded. These problem representations are important because they reflect how public issues are conceived and reproduced throughout society. For this comparative analysis, from the UK, we selected the General Medical Council Promoting Excellent Standards for Medical Education and Training in 2015. And from Australia, we selected 2 documents to be able to cover the same standards. One was Good Medical Practice by the Medical Board of Australia 2014, and Standards for Assessment and Accreditation of Medical Schools from the Australian Medical Council 2010. Key findings of the analysis of these policies highlight a particular construction of disability and illustrate how the language of policy may reflect norms and hidden assumptions that may unintentionally exclude learners with disability who are otherwise qualified to become doctors. The first theme was containment of disability. The ways in which disability is problematized relates to presuppositions that have the effect of restricting access for learners with disability. Disability is then framed as potential educational burden for schools, which must adapt to practices to meet minimal excuse me, minimal legal requirements. The learner with a disability somehow needs to be accommodated rather than included and valued. And the system needs to withstand, tolerate, and adapt. The policies were silent on the value that diversity and including people with disability brings to the workforce. I have to say now that there is, of course, a huge change in the wording in 2019 GMC document, which is entitled Welcome and Valued. The second theme, disability and competence. Both policies note that reasonable adjustments may help disabled learners meet the standards of competence while learning, but the standards themselves cannot be changed, which by inference then means weakened. The AMC policy provided no reference to supports or adjustments during assessment, though it suggested that students with a disability are more likely to have problems with meeting the requirements of the course and of medical practice. The onus to meet competence standards is shifted to individuals by requiring schools to provide advice on the demands of the course and of the first postgraduate year, with the inference that would-be applicants can be deterred from applying. Disability and risk is the third theme. It extends the idea of disability as a threat to competence and thus to being a good doctor. Risk is conceptualized as a quality of individuals rather than being constructed through interactions between persons and environments. The concept of impairment is invoked in these standards as part of health status and disability, but also when referring to concerning behaviours, for example, drug and alcohol abuse, which are associated with unsafe or unprofessional practice. Therefore, by association, then impairment suggests unsafe or unprofessional practice by individuals with disability, framing disability as a potential risk to patients. We know that there is no evidence to support the notion that people with disability present more risk to patients than anyone else. The GMC Welcome and Value document also emphasised that disability or health-related condition alone is certainly not a fitness to practice concern. Still, medical students' fear of stigma and discrimination on disclosure persist, and it's not surprising. People with disability are subject to ableist attitude in many sectors, often especially in the healthcare system. And ableism, the disability-based stigma that results in discriminatory attitudes and behaviours, is often described as being entrenched in the medical profession. Fiona Kumari Campbell suggested that ableism is more than a matter of ignorance or negative attitudes towards disabled people. Rather, and I quote, ableism is deeply seated at the level of epistemological systems of life, personhood, power, and livability. And that's end quote, and beginning another one, ableist corporeal configuration is immutable, permanent, and laden with qualities of perfectionism, end quote. These are structures, values, and assumptions deeply embedded in medicine, and we'll need to examine how inclusion of medical students and doctors with disability may be challenged by these deeply rooted ideas. Excuse me. Campbell suggests, quote, that the most serious assertion is that doctors represent one of the disabling professions which contributes to the social exclusion and dependence of disabled people, end quote. One reason is that the medical profession continues to play a powerful role in the lives of people with disability. Doctors are regarded by medical associations and governments alike as authorised experts having the power of disability certification and acting as gatekeepers to specialist services and supportive funding. Also, medicine is, at the base, a discipline that thinks pathologically. According to a velocity of knowledge that has exponentially increased since the 18th century via scientific experimentation and technological advance, Nielsen suggests that medicine functions according to the basic idea that healthy is normal, unhealthy is abnormal, which aligns not normal with unhealthy and not able. In terms of inclusion in medical education, this is then at odds with the elitist notions around what constitutes a good doctor and with some of the core values in the highly competitive medical education environment, such as perfectionism and competence. So reflecting back now on Nera Jane's finding, as disclosure is a personal choice, students may find themselves in the difficult situation of risking reputation as less able by disclosing disability versus establishing themselves as an asset to the profession by making do with less. So, with literature exploration and analysis of policies illustrating how ableism drives attitudes in the professions, I wanted to explore the broader community views and attitudes on students and medical practitioners with disability. Research on community views on and attitudes towards disability in the health profession is sparse. And at the time, only one other paper was located. It was a qualitative study using focus groups in the UK by Versico and Roberts. So the focus on my second article published in 2019, also with Professor Wendy Hu, was a survey exploring views and attitudes in the local southwest of Sydney community. The survey received just over 200 responses, with questions that included skip logic and non-forced responses. This is a very abbreviated summary of what we found. Only descriptive stats were used for this particular paper, and the two main findings are listed on the slide. We found that almost 3/4 of the respondents agreed that a person with a disability or chronic condition should be encouraged to study medicine, and more than 3/4 of the sample agreed that being inclusive of people with disability or chronic illness would be an advantage in practicing medicine. Amazingly, the data included over 500 rich free text responses, which we analysed thematically alongside the fixed answer questions to gain some understanding of the stats. We're using Pat Basely's approach to concurrent mixed methods analysis. So 5 integrated themes explain these views. The first one, that medical schools are expected to implement fair selection, support and monitoring when recruiting medical students. So most respondents expressed a trust in medical school to employ this fair and equal selection process to recruit those with ability and capacity to study medicine, and not based on whether or not they were disabled or not. Secondly, many respondents described people with real experiences of illness and disability as bringing empathy to the profession. One stated that this is a unique and currently undervalued perspective to the profession and medicine. Thirdly, suggestions were that specific careers should be considered for those with disability. For example, some said that the opportunity to be inclusive would provide meaningful employment for individuals, be enriching and improve their quality of life, as well as provide specialised skills for particular groups. There were frequent references to the beneficial contribution of deaf doctors, for example. However, there was also a common thread throughout responses that medical students with disabilities should carefully consider areas of practice that would be suitable for them. A notion that is somewhat at odds with the generalist practitioner model, or the undifferentiated physician model, I believe is the equivalent term. The fourth theme was about how the medical profession could play an important role in addressing disabling social barriers to inclusion by employing doctors with lived experience of disability and chronic illness. This could benefit the wider community through increased equality. This notion included the ideal that professions should mirror local populations. The final theme centered on the significant responsibilities of doctors and the expectations to function in often stressful environments. and the expectations of self-care in these environments. There were also some concerns whether medical students with disability who were able to pass exam would be able to practice medicine on graduation and have long careers as doctors, which perhaps indicate that some people are not quite aware of the training their medical students go through before graduating. There was one comment that questioned why, since entry to medicine is so competitive, should the pool of applicants be increased in this way? So while these findings were overwhelmingly positive, a few responses indicate that some ableist ideas and negative attitudes towards towards people with disability, and I suppose that these may persist until, until inclusion in medical education and practice is more visible. So back to the Medical Dean's Inclusive Medical Education Guidance document, which was launched in April last year, and which is hopefully the early beginnings of Australian medical schools becoming more welcoming of students with disability. The document was developed through a 2-year process by a working group with representatives from 15 medical schools in Australia and New Zealand, the Medical Board of Australia, the Australian Medical Council, the Medical Council of New Zealand, the Australian Medical Student Association President, Doctors with Disability Australia, and wide consultation with community organisations. The chair of the group, along with a policy writer, sought legal counsel along the way on various points of discussion. I was fortunate to be part of the process from the very beginning and was able to inform the work by drawing on the research findings that I have just summarised, my background in occupational therapy and critical disability studies. You might find it interesting that the original task was to update what was called the inherent requirements to studying medicine in Australia and New Zealand, which I believe are similar to those called technical standards in the US. And the first few meetings were discussions on what points needed to be changed and how. The approach changed, in a session where Dr. Dinesh Palipana, who's on the photo here, and I were able to present together. Dinesh is the co-founder of Doctors with Disability in Australia. We had met a couple of years earlier when he was about to graduate. I don't know how many are familiar with Dinesh's story. He sustained a spinal cord injury in a motor vehicle accident when he was 2 years into his medical studies. In this session, he presented his lived experience of resuming medical school after having been advised to change paths. He had started a law degree but wanted to return to medicine. He described how, after lengthy negotiation, particular staff at his medical school had advocated and supported him to become only the second medical graduate in Australia with quadriplegia. After Dinesh's talk, I was able to follow with explanation of the findings from our policy analysis, which didn't show support for inclusion, versus support in the community for inclusive practice, along with the existing evidence from elsewhere, UK and US. The group was initially silent, but then a consensus emerged that the exclusionary concepts associated with the inherent requirement needed an overhaul, a complete overhaul, a significant change. The members unanimously agreed that a strengths-based approach was much more appropriate for progression in medical education and practice. So that was the beginning of the new inclusive guidelines. We know that they're not yet perfect, but certainly a step in the right direction. So how do we take the next steps? Individually, as educators, as researchers, as members of faculty, as a network. What else needs to change in order to build better participation and inclusion in medical education? How do we initiate a process of transformative education leading to systemic change in medicine that will combat stigma and discrimination? How do we drive a culture change that counter ableism ideas in order to build diversity, inclusion and practice that promote equity. We, of course, need to continue to do our research and educate people, collaborate with each other, and debate change through communities of practice. We also need to continue to question and change the language of policy and standards reflecting embedded norms and hidden assumptions, which in turn may lead to the unintended consequences of perpetuating barriers to learners with disability. These can be addressed by identifying different frameworks, for example, by reconceptualizing competence and risk as the products of interactions between environments and systems and how they fit or not with individuals, rather than be seen as inherent qualities of individuals. In the Medical Dean's Inclusive Guidelines, we have used the World Health Organization International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health Model, which is just depicted here, to help explain these interactions. We also need to continue to explore what skills are actually required by doctors and what reasonable adjustments or accommodations may look like, especially with advances in technology that are gradually expanding the pipeline for applicants with disability by both creating new means of accommodations and making accommodations that were too clunky or too expensive, easier and cheaper. Think telemedicine, game technology, nanotechnology, neurotechnology, AI, robotics, health wearables, and so forth. We also need to look at curriculum development and better education of medical students about disability issues to consider educational options rooted in justice, along with structural mechanisms to challenge stigma and discrimination. Despite the likelihood of medical professionals seeing people with disability in their daily practice, few medical schools in Australia provide curricula that offer a socio-political lens on disability issues, or opportunities for students to properly understand health and social inequities for people with disability. So to finish up, some thoughts for discussion to move forward and to make people with disability more visible in medicine. I'm thinking on a disability justice approach. Disability justice is defined slightly different by different groups, but essentially centers on intersectionality and the ways in which diverse systems of oppression amplify and reinforce one another. It is based on both inclusion and human rights principles. Naomi Ortiz is a writer, poet, facilitator, and visual artist whose work focuses on self-care for activists. Defines disability justice as across disability, so sensory, intellectual, mental health, psychiatric, neurodiversity, physical mobility, learning, and so forth. Framework that values access, self-determination, and expectation of difference. An expectation of difference means that we expect difference in disability identity and culture. Mia Mingus explains, with disability justice, we want to move away from the myth of independence, that everyone can and should be able to do everything on their own. Paddy Byrne has authored a piece on disability justice with 10 principles for a disability justice approach. The Australian Human Rights Commission has outlined a disability justice approach, which includes 5 principles that perhaps could be useful to begin to build a framework for better participation in the medical education and practice. Inclusion and participation in education and work is a human right, but the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability more clearly state that people with disability must be provided with necessary modification and adjustments in order to obtain effective access and better participation in training, employment, and social justice in their daily lives. So with a human rights approach, it should be ideally led by people with disability and or through leadership partnerships with allies and advocates. Secondly, it should be coordinated across stakeholders that contribute to or deliver outcomes in medical education. Thirdly, it should involve actions that are embedded in operational plans and connected to an accountability framework. And finally, it needs to be monitored and evaluated for effectiveness and progress and adjusted in light of experience. I know that I've touched on a lot of issues today, and so I'm now going to leave my presentation here for discussion. I'll just leave you with these quotes by Albrecht. This chapter, which is in the Handbook of Sociology of Medical Education by Bruston and Turner, was one of the early readings that really resonated with me. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I will finish up here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mogensen, for that very insightful and thought-provoking discussion of your research and kind of your thinking in this space. So at the moment, we can begin to take questions. Richard, are you able, actually, I can stop the recording.